Precious sat frozen in her mother's dimly lit sitting room, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her seat. The air felt thick, suffocating, like a silent force pressing down on her chest. Across from her, the old prophetess sat with eyes that seemed to pierce straight into her soul. "You cannot marry him," the woman whispered, her voice carrying an eerie certainty. Precious swallowed hard. "Why?" The prophetess leaned forward, her wrinkled fingers tracing a slow circle on the wooden table between them. "If you marry Tony, you will die." A shiver raced down Precious's spine. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. The words clung to the air like smoke, filling the room with a chilling presence. It didn't make sense. Tony was everything she had ever wanted, kind, loving, and devoted. How could loving him lead to her death? "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old woman's eyes darkened. "I see blood. I see betrayal. And I see the end of everything you know. Walk away now, before it's too late." Terror gripped her chest. She wanted to dismiss it, to call it nonsense, but deep inside, something whispered that this was no ordinary warning. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw shadows creeping closer, whispers in the dark, unseen hands reaching for her. By morning, the decision was made. With a heavy heart, Precious met Tony at their favorite cafe, where he sat waiting, smiling as she approached. He had no idea his world was about to shatter. She sat across from him, forcing herself to meet his warm, trusting eyes. "I can't do this," she whispered. Tony frowned. "Do what?" She swallowed back tears. "Us. The wedding. I can't marry you." The confusion on his face twisted into pain. "Precious, what are you saying?" She looked away, unable to bear the hurt in his eyes. She couldn't tell him about the prophecy. He would never believe it. "I'm sorry," she choked out. Tony stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, he stood up and walked away. As she watched him disappear through the door, a strange, heavy silence settled over her. She had done what she had to do. She was safe now, wasn't she? But just as she reached for her bag, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Leaving Tony just like that, she looked up and froze. Harrison, Tony's best friend. And the look in his eyes sent a cold, unsettling feeling crawling down her spine. Precious's breath hitched as she met Harrison's piercing gaze. His lips curved into a knowing smile, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, something dark, unreadable. "What do you want, Harrison?" she asked, gripping her bag a little tighter. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers lazily against the table. "I just didn't expect you to break Tony like that." His voice was smooth, casual, too casual. She swallowed. "It's complicated." Harrison chuckled, a low, eerie sound. "Is it?" He tilted his head. "Or did someone tell you to leave him?" Her heart slammed against her ribs. "How did he know?" She forced a laugh. "What are you talking about?" Harrison leaned in, close enough that she could smell his cologne, deep, musky, intoxicating. "You're a terrible liar, Precious." Her fingers twitched. "I don't owe you an explanation." "No," he murmured, his gaze darkening. "But you do owe yourself the truth." Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. "I have to go," she muttered, pushing back her chair. But as she stood, Harrison's hand shot out, gently, yet firmly, gripping her wrist. "Be careful who you listen to, Precious," he said, his voice dropping lower. "Not every prophecy is meant to protect you. Some are designed to control you." Her blood ran cold. What did he mean by that? She yanked her hand free and hurried out of the cafe, her mind racing. How did Harrison know about the prophecy? She had only told her mother, and the prophetess. A shiver crept over her skin. Was someone watching her? As she stepped onto the street, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You made the right choice. But it's not over yet. He's watching you." Her hands trembled. Who was watching her? And more importantly, had she just walked into an even bigger trap? Precious's fingers shook as she gripped her phone. The message stared back at her like a silent threat. "You made the right choice. But it's not over yet. He's watching you." She spun around, scanning the busy Lagos street. Cars honked, people rushed past, vendors shouted at customers. But to Precious, the world had gone eerily still. Who sent this? And more terrifyingly, who was watching her? She swallowed hard and shoved her phone into her bag. She wasn't about to stand there like a sitting duck. Her apartment was only a short walk away. She needed to get inside, lock the doors, and think. As she hurried down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into her back. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Was it real? Or was paranoia creeping in? Then she saw him. A man in a black hoodie, standing near a parked car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. Watching. Her stomach twisted. Was he the one who sent the message? She picked up her pace. Her apartment complex was just a few blocks away. If she could get inside, she'd be safe. But as she turned the corner, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside her. The window rolled down. And there he was. Harrison. Calm. Smirking. Like he had been expecting her. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice smooth as ever. Precious froze. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But before she could respond, he tilted his head and said something that made her blood turn ice cold. "You shouldn't walk home alone, Precious. Not with him following you." Her breath caught. Him. She glanced back, just for a second. The man in the black hoodie was gone. Her stomach dropped. Had he ever been there at all? Harrison's voice cut through the thick silence. "Get in." Her heart pounded against her ribs. Was Harrison protecting her? Or was he the real danger? And if she refused his help, would she live to regret it? Precious's feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The SUV idled beside her, the hum of the engine low and steady. Harrison's gaze locked onto hers, unwavering. "Get in, Precious." Her pulse hammered in her throat. Every instinct screamed no. But the fear of the unknown, of the man in the hoodie, of the warning message, of the prophecy itself, made her hesitate. Harrison sighed, like he could read her mind. "Do you really think you're safer out here?" His voice was calm, smooth, too smooth. "Because if you walk away, I promise you, you won't make it home." A cold shiver crawled down her spine. Was he threatening her, or protecting her? She swallowed hard and pulled open the door. The second she slid inside, the locks clicked shut automatically. Harrison smirked. Smart girl. The air in the car was thick, suffocating. Precious kept her eyes on the road, hands clenched in her lap. "Who was that man?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Harrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his phone. A few swipes, a few taps, then he handed it to her. Her stomach dropped. On the screen was a photo. A grainy CCTV shot of the man in the hoodie. Taken hours ago. Outside her apartment. Her hands trembled. "Where did you get this?" Harrison kept his eyes on the road. "I told you, Precious. You're being watched." Her breath came in sharp gasps. "By who?" He let out a dark chuckle. "That's the wrong question." She turned to him, confusion and terror tightening around her throat. Harrison glanced at her, just for a second, and in that moment, something flickered in his expression. Something unsettling. Not concern. Not fear. Satisfaction. A sick realization twisted in her gut. What if Harrison wasn't saving her? What if he was leading her straight to the people she should be running from? The SUV slowed down. Precious's eyes darted to the window. They weren't heading to her apartment. They were going somewhere else. Somewhere she didn't recognize. She grabbed the door handle. Locked. Harrison let out a soft laugh. "Relax, Precious. You're safer with me." Her hands trembled. Then why did it feel like she was walking into a trap? Precious's heart slammed against her ribs. The SUV moved deeper into an unfamiliar part of the city. Dark streets, no traffic, no life. She forced herself to stay calm. "Think, Precious. Think. Where are we going?" Her voice was tight, controlled. Harrison smirked, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. Somewhere safe. A lie. She knew it. The doors were locked. Her phone was in her bag, but would she even have time to use it? She had to act fast. She reached for her bag slowly, pretending to adjust her seatbelt. Just as her fingers brushed against her phone, Harrison snatched it off her lap. "Looking for this?" He held it up, his grip firm. Her stomach twisted. He had been watching her the whole time. "You don't trust me, Precious?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock innocence. Her throat was dry. "Should I?" Harrison chuckled. "That depends. Do you believe in destiny?" A cold chill ran through her. She turned to the window, searching for anything familiar. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows on old buildings. Then she saw it. A lone figure, standing at the end of the street. Her breath caught. The man in the hoodie. But he wasn't watching her. He was watching Harrison. Her blood ran cold. What did that mean? Who was the real threat here? Then, without warning, bang! Something slammed into the side of the car. Harrison cursed and swerved, tires screeching. Precious barely had time to react as her door flew open. Hands grabbed her, pulled her out. The world spun. She hit the ground hard, gasping. Above her, the man in the hoodie loomed, his face still hidden in the shadows. "Run," he ordered. His voice was deep, commanding, familiar. Precious froze. She knew this voice. But before she could place it, Harrison was already out of the car. And the look in his eyes? Murderous. Precious's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. The rough asphalt scraped against her palms as she scrambled backward, her eyes darting between the two men. Harrison stood a few feet away, his face a mask of cold fury. His usual smooth, collected demeanor was gone. Now his jaw was clenched, his fists balled, his entire body taut like a predator ready to strike. The man in the hoodie took a step forward, shielding Precious. "Stay back, Harrison," he warned. His voice, low, commanding, sent a strange shiver down her spine. Harrison scoffed. "You really think I don't know who you are?" His lips curled into a smirk. "Or what you've been doing?" Precious's mind spun. What was happening? Who was this man? Slowly, the hooded figure turned toward her. And then, he pulled the hood down. Precious's heart stopped. Tony, the man she left. The man she had been warned not to marry. The man she thought she had doomed. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Harrison let out a dark chuckle. "Surprise, surprise." Precious shook her head, trying to make sense of it all. "Tony, how?" Tony's eyes softened, just for a second, but his voice was firm. "I never stopped watching over you, Precious." His gaze flicked to Harrison, darkening. "Because I knew something wasn't right." Harrison took a slow step forward. "And now what? You think you're going to save her?" He laughed bitterly. "You're too late." Tony stiffened. "Too late for what?" Harrison's eyes flickered with something dangerous. Something unhinged. Precious felt it before she saw it. A sharp click. A glint of metal. A knife. Her blood turned to ice. Harrison tilted his head, smirking. "You should have stayed away, Tony." The street was deathly silent. Precious's pulse thundered. She had been running from the wrong danger all along. Now she wasn't running. She was trapped. And Harrison? He was ready to finish what he started. The street felt colder, darker, like the night itself was holding its breath. Precious's eyes locked onto the blade in Harrison's hand. Sharp. Deadly. Too close. Tony stood firm, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. "Harrison," he said, voice low and steady. "You don't have to do this." Harrison laughed. A hollow, bitter sound. "Don't have to." His eyes flicked to Precious. "You think I spent all these months waiting, setting everything up, just to stop now?" Months. Precious's stomach twisted. He had been planning this. Tony tensed. The prophecy. Harrison's grip on the knife tightened. His expression shifted, twisted, into something almost amused. "Oh, the prophecy," he mocked. "The little warning that made her run from you straight into my arms?" He chuckled darkly. "It worked, didn't it?" Precious's heart dropped. It was never real. She staggered back. You made it up?" Harrison shrugged. "Not me personally, but I knew the right people. A whisper here, a warning there. Superstitious fools do the rest." A lump formed in her throat. He had manipulated her. He had stolen her life, her love, with a lie. Her hands clenched into fists. "You wanted me to leave Tony." Harrison's smirk deepened. "I needed you to." Tony's entire body went rigid. "Why?" Harrison exhaled sharply, as if Tony had asked something ridiculous. "Because you had everything, and you didn't even see it. Money, power, a future." He tilted his head. "And Precious?" She was just the perfect bonus. Precious's breath hitched. Bonus. Not love. Not destiny. A prize to be taken. Tony took a step forward. "You betrayed me." Harrison's smirk vanished. His grip on the knife twitched. "No, Tony. You betrayed yourself." His eyes darkened. "You never deserved any of it." Then, he lunged. The knife flashed under the streetlights. Precious screamed. Tony moved fast, too fast, grabbing Harrison's wrist before the blade could find its mark. A struggle. A grunt. The knife clattered to the ground. Harrison's fist swung. Tony ducked. Precious's heart pounded. This wasn't just a fight. This was war. And she didn't know who would make it out alive. The fight was brutal. Tony and Harrison crashed into the pavement, fists flying, bodies colliding in a violent blur. Precious stood frozen, her breath coming in short gasps as she watched the two men battle like animals. This wasn't just about her. This was personal. Tony pinned Harrison to the ground, his fist raised, eyes blazing with fury. "You destroyed everything," he roared. Harrison's lips curled into a bloody smirk. "I played the game better than you." Tony's fist connected with his jaw. Once. Twice. Precious flinched at the sickening sound. Harrison coughed, blood dripping from his lips, yet he still laughed. Why was he laughing? Then he looked at her. Straight into her soul. You think this is over? His voice was hoarse, but laced with something chilling. Victory. Precious shivered. What are you talking about? Harrison groaned, shifting slightly beneath Tony's grip. He glanced up at his old friend, then back at her. Tony, he rasped. You always thought I was the problem. He exhaled sharply, his lips twisting. But did you ever wonder who gave me the idea? Tony's brows furrowed. Precious felt a deep, unsettling chill crawl up her spine. What are you saying? She whispered. Harrison's smirk widened. I wasn't the only one who wanted you two apart. Tony's grip on him faltered slightly. Who? A low chuckle. You'll never believe me. Precious's fists clenched. Try me. Harrison inhaled sharply, his bruised face twisted in something between pain and pleasure. And then he said it. A name. A name that sent Precious's world crashing down. Tony froze. His entire body stiffened. Precious staggered back. No, it couldn't be. Harrison let out a wheezing laugh. Told you. Precious felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Because the real betrayal wasn't just Harrison's. It was someone else. Someone closer. Someone she never expected. And now, she had no idea who she could trust. The world around Precious blurred. She barely heard Harrison's ragged breathing, barely saw the blood staining Tony's knuckles. Because the name Harrison had just whispered shattered everything. Tony's face was stone. His body was still. Too still. Tell me you're lying, he said, his voice low, dangerous. Harrison just smiled. A bloody, wicked smile. Go ahead, he rasped. Ask her yourself. Her. Precious's knees nearly buckled. She turned slowly, her mind screaming, her heart hammering against her ribs as her gaze landed on the one person who should have been on her side from the start. Her mother. There she was, standing just beyond the streetlight's glow, her expression calm. Too calm. Tony sucked in a sharp breath. Mrs. Williams? Precious's mother met his eyes. Then, slowly, she turned to her daughter. My love, she said softly. I only did what was necessary. Precious felt like she had been punched in the chest. You're the reason for the prophecy? Her voice cracked. You made me leave Tony? Her mother sighed. I only wanted to protect you. Protect me. Precious's hands shook. From what? Mrs. Williams finally stepped forward, her face unreadable. From him. She pointed at Tony. Tony's jaw clenched. What are you talking about? Harrison groaned from the ground, chuckling darkly. Go on, tell them, Mama. Tell them why you did it. Her mother ignored him. Her eyes stayed on Precious. Did you ever wonder, she said carefully, why Tony's family never wanted this wedding? The words hit like a slap. Precious inhaled sharply. What? Tony took a step forward. My family had nothing to do with this. Her mother's gaze flicked to him. Didn't they? A thick silence settled between them. Precious's mind raced. No, this didn't make sense. Her mother's lips pressed together. Then she finally said it. The truth that had been buried for years. Tony's father was responsible for your father's death. The world stopped. Tony's face drained of color. That's a lie. Mrs. Williams shook her head. It's not. Precious stumbled back, her pulse roaring in her ears. No, she whispered. That can't be true. Her mother's face softened. I wanted you far away from him. Far away from his family's sins. Her voice dropped lower. Because marrying into that bloodline meant living in the shadow of a man who destroyed our lives. Precious felt like she couldn't breathe. Tony's voice was barely above a whisper. I never knew. Her mother nodded. I believe you. Then, her gaze hardened. But that doesn't change the past. Harrison laughed again, shaking his head. And you all thought I was the villain. Precious's body trembled. Everything she believed, every decision she made, had been manipulated. By Harrison. By her mother. By fate itself. And now, she had one final choice to make. Walk away. Or fight for the truth. The street was deathly silent. Precious felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Her mother. The prophecy. Tony's family. Harrison's lies. It had all been one giant manipulation. She turned to Tony, searching his face. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the pain in his eyes. The weight of his family's sins pressing down on him. His father, the man responsible for her father's death. Could she ever look at him the same way again? Her mother's voice was calm, too calm. Now do you see why I had to stop you? Precious's hands curled into fists. You never gave me a choice. Her mother's face darkened. I did what I had to do. Precious let out a sharp breath. No, her voice shook, but she stood her ground. You manipulated me. Lied to me. You let fear control you, and then you used it to control me. Her mother flinched, but she didn't deny it. Harrison groaned, sitting up, his lips twisted in a bloody smirk. This is fun, he muttered. But let's be real. What happens now? Tony's fists clenched. You don't get to speak. Harrison just laughed. Oh, Tony. Still acting like the hero. After everything. He shook his head. I didn't create this mess. I just took advantage of it. Precious's stomach twisted. And he was right. Harrison hadn't lied about everything. He had only exposed the cracks that had already been there. Precious took a shaky breath. What now? Did she walk away from Tony forever? Did she forgive him for something he never did? And her mother, the woman who had raised her, protected her, but also trapped her. Was she the real villain here? Precious's heart pounded. She had to choose. And she knew, in that moment, there was only one thing left to do. Break free. She turned to Tony. I don't know what this means for us, she said honestly. But I'm not running anymore. Tony's eyes softened. Then she turned to her mother. I love you, she said quietly. But I won't live in your fear. Her mother's face cracked with emotion. And finally, Precious faced Harrison, the man who had played them all. I hope it was worth it. Harrison smirked. Oh, it was. Precious stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, she walked away. From the lies, the fear, the past. This wasn't about fate anymore. It was about her. And for the first time in her life, she was taking control of it. Thank you for watching. Kindly share your thoughts about the story in the comment section. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.